I'm just testing the microphone for the moment. It worked very well yesterday, I think. Are you everyone happy with the sound as it is there? Thank you. Could I just, while we're just doing that, and a few people are still settling in, just ask you just to check your cell phone. I didn't do that yesterday, and I was embarrassed that mine actually pinged. So, so you don't have the same embarrassment. Would you be kind enough just to check that? Thank you so much. A friend of mine has a clock that says 5 o'clock, and I said, why is it 5 o'clock? And she says, well, it's always 5 o'clock somewhere. It's always 11:15 somewhere. Good. So I think we're all here. That's good. Let's just settle in. So William Hogarth, an artist perhaps not familiar to everybody, and I really do believe not as well known as he should be. So let's just see William Hogarth and London. So today, London, a city that as the 18th century was about to dawn, also saw the birth of William Hogarth, one of the most socially aware of all artists, whose art is a wonderful mirror reflecting life in Georgian London, its exuberance and splendour, but also its failings and squalor. And here he is, in this self-portrait, painted when in his late 40s, resting his arm on volumes of Shakespeare, Milton, and Swift, his faithful companion Pug at his side. England had just been through a very traumatic period, with the public beheading of its King Charles I, authorised by this warrant, signed by members of the tribunal that found him guilty of treason for his role in a civil war that for 7 long years had torn the country apart. England was now ruled by this man, the parliamentarian's brilliant army commander, Oliver Cromwell. He was also a messianic Puritan who, in a fit of religious zeal, ordered the closure of all of England's theatres and outlawed even traditional Christmas celebrations, which he denounced as pagan. Following Cromwell's death, the English Parliament negotiated the return of the executed king's son, Charles II, from his European exile to formally take up the throne. Here we see him setting out from Rotterdam in the Dutch Republic, bound for Dover, where in May of 1660 he landed, arriving 4 days later in London, where it was said the whole city turned out to greet him. Thus began the hedonistic reign of Charles II, which weary Londoners were only too ready to embrace. At 30 years old, 6 foot tall, with dark wavy hair and sparkling eyes, he was every bit a ladies' man. Although married to the daughter of the King of Portugal, he had numerous mistresses who produced for him at least 12 illegitimate children. A favourite of the theatre-loving king was this popular and gifted comic actress, Eleanor Gwynne, known as Nell. The daughter of a single alcoholic mother, She had started out at the age of 16 selling oranges to the audience at the newly licensed King's Company Playhouse. She would go on to produce for the king yet 2 more children. So what did London actually look like in 1660? Here in the foreground, just to the right of centre, is Lambeth Palace, the seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Across the River Thames, spanned at the time by just a single bridge, the North Bank, its skyline dominated by St. Paul's Cathedral, its square Gothic tower having lost its spire in a thunderstorm. The return of the king brought the gentry back to the city, but with raw sewage being discharged into the river, which flowed in an easterly direction, the West End was the place to be. London now suffered 2 back-to-back calamities. First, in 1665, there was an outbreak of bubonic plague, which killed, it is estimated, 1/3 of the city's population. Then, the following year, on the 2nd of September 1666, in the early hours of the morning, a fire broke out in the Farriner's Bakery in Pudding Lane. The mayor was woken with the news, telling his informant, "Go find a woman to piss it out," before going back to sleep. By morning that day, 300 wooden thatch roof houses were consumed in the flames. A strong wind now came up, blowing the flames westward, accompanied by the terrible sound of crackling wood and people screaming. The fire burned for 3 days before the wind finally dropped. 2/3 of the city within its walls, here in the area in white in this map, were gone. 1,300 houses, 87 churches, the Guildhall, the Royal Exchange, as well as St. Paul's Cathedral, the lead from its roof, having melted, flowed down Ludgate Hill like a silver river. Rebuilding, however, was swift. A committee of 6 was convened to come up with a plan, which included Christopher Wren, Professor of Astronomy at Oxford University, who also had some knowledge of architecture. His master plan for a neoclassical London was rejected, but he was charged with rebuilding St. Paul's Cathedral as well as 50 new churches. But now houses were required to be built of brick or stone and were limited to 4 stories along the main roads and just 2 stories on the side streets. London's skyline was again dominated by St. Paul's Cathedral, but now by the dome of Wren's Renaissance masterpiece, flanked by the spires of his new churches. But by 1685, the year Charles II died, England was already embroiled in a series of wars against France, in which it achieved major victories, most notably here in the Battle of Blenheim by General John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. With these victories, England was on the brink of becoming a world power. The face of London, now Europe's largest city, was also changing, with elegant new squares inspired by the architect Inigo Jones's earlier remodelling here of Covent Garden Market, creating this Italian-inspired colonnaded piazza. The city's narrow defensive gates, suitable for the passage of sedan chairs, were now torn down to make way for the horse-drawn carriages that before long were clogging the streets. London's river docks, here by the Tower of London, were now crowded with ships unloading their cargoes from England's ever-growing overseas empire. Sugar and cocoa from the West Indies, tobacco, cotton, indigo and rice from its American colonies, and also tea and spices from the Far East, as well as iron from the Baltic. With the establishment of the Bank of England and Lloyd's Insurance Company, London was becoming a major financial centre, its population now enjoying unprecedented prosperity. The beating heart for all this economic activity was here in the Royal Exchange, where traders and clients now did their transactions instead of in the more traditional coffee houses. The mood was one of buoyant optimism, in which fortunes were made, but also lost, most spectacularly with the bursting of the South Sea bubble. Stock certificates in the South Sea Company had soared in value in a buying frenzy fueled by the expectation of vast profits from the opening up of trade with Spanish South America. But it all came crashing down with the financial ruin of thousands of investors when year after year the company failed to produce the profit. Among the speculators was Isaac Newton, who famously said, "I can predict the movement of the stars, but not the madness of men." Around the same time, there was also a crisis affecting the monarchy. For in 1714, Queen Anne, plagued by chronic ill health, died, leaving no successor. She was eventually discovered to have a German cousin, this man, Georg Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, who, although speaking no English, agreed to come to Britain to take up the throne as King George I. This, then, was the London in which William Hogarth, then just 17 years old, was growing up. Born near Smithfield Meat Market to the east of the city, he lived almost his entire life around Covent Garden, recording as an artist the follies, the vices of his fellow Londoners, both the privileged and the poor. Indeed, he was well placed to appreciate both sides of society, for his father, a schoolteacher, had spent 4 years incarcerated here in the Fleet Prison for debtors, whilst William himself in later life would join the upper echelons of society with his appointment as Sergeant Painter to the King. After basic schooling, William was apprenticed to an engraver, where he displayed exceptional talent. Starting up on his own, he produced both elegant book plates and trade cards, including this, his own, which he handed out to prospective clients. He now merged these skills with his keen eye for what was going on around him. In this, his first satirical engraving depicting the South Sea Company fiasco. There in the centre, we can see a dense crowd of would-be investors who are clamouring to join those already on a merry-go-round, at the top of which is a goat. whilst here in the foreground, honour and honesty are being flogged to death. There on the far left, we can see the devil gleefully admiring his handiwork. London was in reality two cities, both in a moral morass. One for the haves, living in their fine houses, the other the have-nots, living in the smelly and squalid East End, rife with crime and prostitution. Prostitution was in fact evident throughout the city, although attitudes were schizophrenic. On one hand, courtesans were regarded as the respectable consorts of aristocrats, even the king, whereas common whores were the despised carriers of disease. Prompted by the government's campaign to clean up the streets of London, Hogarth produces this set of engravings he calls A Harlot's Progress. Here, in the first scene, a young seamstress, Moll, newly arrived in the city looking for work, is greeted at the Bell Inn by Mother Needham in the black shawl wear, whose face is already marked by syphilis. At the bottom right, in a basket, a gullible goose who has seen it all before, whilst in the doorway, a man who fondles himself in knowing anticipation. Moll is now a kept woman of a wealthy aristocrat, who, having set her up in a luxurious apartment, arrives unexpectedly for tea. Moll, meanwhile, had taken a young lover there hiding behind the door with her maid. Moll now knocks over the table to distract her visitor, allowing her lover to escape. Aside, Moll is now a common prostitute, living in a dingy garret. As her syphilitic maid pours milk from a jug, Moll dangles a fob watch she has just stolen from a client. On the wall behind her, a witch's hat and a switch indicating some of the services on offer to a new client who has just walked in. Now in Bridewell prison for petty criminals, Moll is put to work beating hemp, herself threatened with a beating by her warder. By a twist of fate, an unexpected reversal of roles. Now, Moll, in the terminal stages of syphilis, sits propped up in front of a fire, undergoing a sweating cure. Her infant son squatting at her feet. On the left, two quack physicians argue as to which of their totally useless cures was obviously the better. Finally, the wake, where Moll's son, now in mourning clothes, sits beneath his mother's coffin. Among her fellow prostitutes and attendants, one admires herself in a mirror, whilst another on the right is being propositioned by the undertaker. Yet another on the far left feels the hand of the parson, which he has slipped under her skirt. Hogarth now turns his keen eye towards the upper classes, starting with those not yet quite there, but with social pretensions, in a series of paintings he calls a rake's progress. Here we follow the progress of Tom Rakewell, the unprincipled son of a wealthy merchant who fancies himself as an aristocrat. Just down from Oxford University and having inherited his father's fortune, we first meet him being measured for a fine new suit, whilst at the same time paying off a girl he has just made pregnant. Now, living in an elegant townhouse, we find Tom wearing the latest fashion, holding a mourning levee, as if he were the French King Louis XIV. In attendance, his diminutive but elegant dancing master, and at the harpsichord, his singing teacher. There, kneeling on the far right, his fencing instructor. At his shoulder, wearing a tricorn hat, stands his sinister-looking bodyguard. We're now in the Rose Tavern in Drury Lane, where, stone drunk, Tom has been caressed by a prostitute who has just relieved him of his fob watch. On the left, another lets her breast hang out as she adjusts her shoe, whilst behind her in the doorway there in the shadow, a street singer and her companion have just walked in. We are now in a church where Tom, having lost his fortune, is marrying a rich, one-eyed widow. At the same time, eyeing her pretty young maid. Now, having gambled away the fortune she had left him, we find him in the Fleet prison for debtors. Behind him, his warder points to his ledger, showing how much he's owed for all the little extras provided at the request of his family. A scene only too familiar to Hogarth from visits to his own father, who had been confined to the same prison. Finally, having gone mad, Tom is confined to the Bethlehem Hospital for the Insane, where, all but naked, he lies shackled to the floor, being comforted by his visitors. In the background, we can just make out in the shadow other inmates. In the doorway, a king with a crown holding a scepter. And on the far left, a bishop in a mitre is conducting an imaginary service. But there, in full view, a lady holding a fan with her maid who has just entered. For on Sunday afternoons, members of the public could wander in to be amused by the antics of the patients. In addition to these moralizing works, Hogarth was developing a following both for his portraits and conversation pieces, such as this painting of an arts dealer showing a framed picture to a client. A scene with which rising members of the middle class could readily identify. They also thronged to the theatre. Among the plays being performed before packed houses was a revival of John Dryden's Marriage à la Mode, prompting Hogarth to pillory the aristocracy, who, up until now, had escaped his bars. Here, in Hogarth's Marriage à la Mode, we are in the picture gallery of the Earl of Squanderfield, seated there on the right, who points imperiously to his family tree. On the left, in a blue French court coat, his son admires himself in the mirror, whilst the Earl negotiates the terms of his son's marriage to the daughters of the alderman there in a red coat, sitting at the table, who for the occasion has put on his gold chain of office. Behind him, the Earl's lawyer leans lustfully towards the daughter, whilst suggestively sharpening his quill. Now married, we find the couple in their Palladian townhouse in the West End, exhausted For having gone their separate ways, they have spent the night with their respective lovers. Smiling, she glimpses the upturned chair and violin case, suggesting she has been enjoying the attentions of her music teacher. Meanwhile, their manservant, clutching unpaid bills, walks off in disgust. Young Squanderfield, now having contracted syphilis, comes seeking a cure together with his young mistress to see a quack. Himself with a saddle nose and bow legs, signs that he too has the disease. It all ends in high melodrama. Squanderfield has caught his wife in bed with their lawyer. A duel ensues and Squanderfield is killed. The lawyer escapes from the window, but is soon caught and hanged. Finally, the grieving wife, now full of remorse, kills herself. So much then for the morality of the aristocracy. Jane Austen, writing 50 years later, claimed that Hogarth's marriage a la mode had been an inspiration for her novels about the plight of unmarried young women living in the male-dominated society of 19th century England. Alcoholism had now become a major public health problem. For the masses, struggling to make ends meet, were finding solace in cheap gin, sold everywhere from stalls in the street, even from barber shops. The popular refrain, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for twopence," was borne out by a government report stating that 1 in 8 deaths in London, including children, resulted from an addiction to gin. The underlying cause was an embargo on importing brandy from France, with whom Britain was at war. As compensation, the government lifted the restrictions on the distillation of gin, with the result that stills were popping up everywhere to meet the demand. Spurred by a report that a woman had killed her baby to sell its clothes in order to buy gin, Hogarth now shows London's social fabric on the point of collapse. From Hogarth's perspective, the only surviving businesses are the pawnbroker, there on the left, and on the right, the gin distillery and the undertaker. And there, sitting on the steps, a mother, senseless from gin, lets her baby fall to its death. A consequence of the gin epidemic was the sharp increase in the number of abandoned children, who were simply gathered up off the streets and put in parish workhouses, more akin to prisons than places of shelter, where many died from disease, malnutrition, or simply neglect. But by mid-century, this splendid complex, the Foundling Hospital, was completed in central London. More a residential home than a hospital, there abandoned children would thrive and could remain until well into adolescence. The philanthropist who made this possible was this wealthy retired ship captain, Thomas Cora, revealed in this affectionate portrait by Hogarth to be a genial man in a plain black suit under his naval greatcoat, totally without pretensions. Hogarth, who had no children of his own, would become a governor of the hospital. Life for the children of the well-to-do was one of indulgence and comfort. Here Hogarth paints the portraits of the 4 children of Daniel Graham, apothecary to the king. Yet, even for the wealthy, infant mortality was high. Here Hogarth retained and completed the portrait of the youngest, there on the far left, who fell ill and died whilst Hogarth was still working on the painting. Hogarth had by now also become a highly sought-after portrait painter. Here, the renowned actor and theatre owner David Garrick in the role of Shakespeare's Richard III. He goes on to paint the actor relaxing at home with his wife, Eva Marie. For, as with Captain Coram, Hogarth and the Garricks had by now become firm friends. There were also portraits of holders of high public office. Here, William Herring, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Although Hogarth was by now the most celebrated English artist of his generation, he never forgot his modest roots. Here in this touching group portrait, having never married, he puts himself at the centre, surrounded by his servants, in effect, his extended family. To gain esteem among their peers, artists were required to demonstrate prowess as a history painter. Here, Hogarth obliges by depicting Jesus healing the sick at the Pool of Bethesda, a painting commissioned by the governors of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where today it still hangs above the grand staircase. Beyond the follies and foibles of his fellow citizens, Hogarth remained well aware throughout his life of what was going on in Britain at large. In 1727, following the death of his father, the pleasure-loving George II, seen here in one of his more flamboyant outfits, ascended the throne. Yet his reign saw the expansion of the British Empire, adding Quebec in Canada, Georgia as the 13th American colony, and the biggest prize of all, India. But on the continent of Europe, Britain, together with its allies, was engaged in an almost constant war against France and its ambition to become Europe's dominant power. Here we see George II on his white horse, leading his troops, at least nominally, at the Battle of Dettingen in Bavaria. It would be the last time a British monarch would personally lead his troops into battle. But closer to home, trouble was again brewing beyond England's northern border in rugged, damp, and misty Scotland. Back in 1707, the crowns of England and Scotland had been formally joined in an act of union, creating Great Britain. The real power, however, remained firmly with the government in London. In 1745, long simmering resentment towards this arrangement culminated in Scottish nationalists mounting yet another rebellion. This time led by Charles Edward Stuart, known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, who had secretly returned from exile with the aim of restoring a Catholic Stuart king to the English throne. England's response to the threat of a Scottish invasion was initially half-hearted, prompting Hogarth to paint this boisterous, carnival-like scene in the village of Finchley, just north of London, where soldiers were attempting to enlist men for the army. But by the following spring, England had finally got its act together, resoundingly defeating the Scots at the Battle of Culloden in the Scottish Highlands, here depicted by the painter David Morley. Retribution was swift. Displays of the tartan and the playing of bagpipes were forbidden, and many of the rebel leaders were executed. Among them was this 80-year-old Scottish peer, Lord Lovat, chief of Clan Fraser, who had sided with the rebels. Found guilty of high treason, he was brought to London, where Hogarth made this foiled sketch of him just prior to his public beheading on Tower Hill. Nor did the colourful and raucous nature of English politics escape Hogarth's eagle eye. Here we're outside an Oxfordshire inn during an election campaign, where a gentleman in a greatcoat and tricorn hat is being offered money in exchange for his vote. It is now polling day, where the gentleman seated on the platform is being gently persuaded where to put his mark. Now, with all the votes counted, the winning candidate is carried aloft in a carnival-like atmosphere replete with musicians and a chained monkey, whilst in the foreground, two supporters of rival factions fight it out with clubs. Nor did Hogarth spare the church. Earlier, he had painted this scene, in which a preacher is delivering a sermon, during which not only the congregation, but even the vicar have fallen asleep. But now, Hogarth is unsparing in his criticism of what he saw as the exaggerated enthusiasms of John Wesley's new Methodist revival movement, prompting this engraving, in which vignettes abound. There at the top, for example, a witch on a broomstick and the devil dangled by a wild-eyed preacher who looks as though he is about to launch himself into space. Whilst below, the congregation is transported into a state of ecstasy. Among the texts Hogarth adds is the evangelist John's warning against false prophets. Thus far, Hogarth has stayed strictly within the bounds of social satire. But now he dips a toe into the world of caricature. In this engraving, in which at the top we see three undertakers who are patiently waiting whilst a group of quacks, one clutching the urinal, wonder which of their useless cures to administer to their patients. Here, in one of his last works, Hogarth portrays three well-known judges in the Court of Common Appeal, all of whom have nodded off as arguments are presented before them. Above is added busts depicting a range of physiognomies, thought at the time to indicate character, a concept that was occupying Hogarth at the time of his death. In October of 1764, Hogarth was suddenly taken ill at home in Leicester Fields, today's Leicester Square, passing away just 2 hours later, alone but for his housekeeper. He was 66 years old. On his tombstone, a tribute in verse from his friend, the actor David Garrick, which began, "Farewell, great painter of mankind." Well said, for William Hogarth was indeed a great satirist who today stands shoulder to shoulder with the ancient Greek playwright Aristophanes, who pilloried the foibles of his fellow Athenians. Also alongside the novelist and cleric Jonathan Swift, the inventor of the comically eccentric characters encountered by Gulliver on his travels, as well as alongside the filmmaker Charles Chaplin, whose Great Dictator brilliantly lampoons one of the greatest tyrants of all time. Where Hogarth was the pictorial master of social satire, it would fall to his successor, another Englishman, James Gilray, to fully exploit a new form of social commentary, the political cartoon. Like Hogarth, Gilray started out as an engraver, but with his sharply critical eye and a sense for the absurd, he turned instead to bringing the high and mighty down to size, a trait that soon endeared him to the public. Living throughout the reign of George III, he took delight in lampooning not only the king and his family, but also the endlessly bickering British politicians, as well as that foreign little upstart, Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, with his work displayed in the windows of London's ubiquitous print shops, he began to shape public opinion regarding events of the day. Here we can see some of his cartoons at the window of his publisher and dealer, Hannah Humphrey, the two living together for many years above her shop. The new king, George III, was initially well liked, but would become unpopular on account of his political meddling and the eventual loss of the American colonies. He was, though, a complex figure, projecting a populist image as Farmer George and for living frugally, affectations which Gilroy savagely pilloried. Here, on the left, we see his wife, Queen Charlotte, sitting at home in front of the fire cooking sprats. Whilst opposite as his kettle is coming to boil, her husband, George III, hunched over the fire, toasting muffins. Now he seats them together at their table, eating a frugal meal, the king just a boiled egg, and the queen some greens. Note how, to save on wear and tear, the dust cover has been left on his chair, whilst to save money on napkins, he has tucked the tablecloth into his collar to protect his shirt front. Among other deft touches, on the wall, an empty picture frame. In reality, the lavish spending by the royal family was of concern to the government as well as public alike, prompting this cartoon by Gilray. Front and centre, an overweight Prince of Wales sits in front of an open door of the Treasury, together with his parents, scoffing down gold coins. We now see His Royal Highness as a glutton, barely able to fit in his chair, his waistcoat about to burst open at any moment. Gilray now attacks the king's artistic pretensions. For having founded the Royal Academy of Art, he fancied himself as an art connoisseur. Here the ever-frugal king squints by the light of a solitary candle at a miniature portrait of that equally frugal statesman, Oliver Cromwell. Party politics in 18th century Britain was, as you can see, a robust affair, with the opposition Whig Party led by Charles Fox, who regarded the king as a tyrant, at constant loggerheads with the ruling Tories led by William Pitt. Thanks to Britain's lax libel laws, Gilray was in his element. Here on the ground we see the hapless George III, about to be beheaded by an axe-wielding Charles Fox, spluttering, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" Whilst there on the right, Queen Charlotte and the Tory Prime Minister are hanging by their necks from a pair of street lamps. But now, to show he could be even-handed, Gilray depicts George and Charlotte safely navigating the ship of state between the rock of democracy and the whirlpool of absolute power, pursued by the dogs of Scylla in the form of the Whig leader Charles Fox and his colleagues. But here, Gilray reminds British anti-monarchists of Robespierre's bloody terror that followed the French Revolution, in which thousands of citizens simply suspected of harbouring royalist sentiments were rounded up and guillotined. In 1795, a mob attacked the King's coach as he was on his way to the state opening of Parliament. 3 days later, Gilray produces this cartoon in which the coachman, Prime Minister Pitt, drives his horses on as Fox and his colleagues open fire on the King, who sits there totally nonplussed by it all. The execution of the French king by the revolutionaries had sent shockwaves through the royal houses of Europe. Here, William Pitt rushes in to tell the king, sitting on his morning throne, that the Swedish king, Gustav III, had just been assassinated. What? Stuttered the king. Shot? But here he portrays the king more favourably. With Napoleon now threatening Britain, Gilray brings the Frenchman down to Lilliputian size on the palm of the king's hand, who, studying him through his telescope, concludes Napoleon is nothing but the most pernicious, odious little reptile that nature had ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth. But now we see Gilray, the realist, with Prime Minister Pitt and Napoleon sitting at the same table, carving out the world between them. But look closer. As a smug-looking William Pitt carves the larger slice, comprising the Atlantic Ocean, Napoleon contents himself with the whole of Europe. Clever stuff, I think. In 1802, the Treaty of Amiens brought to an end 10 years of almost constant warfare. Now a gallant Napoleon plants a kiss on the lips of a buxom Britannia. But behind them on the wall, the portraits of Napoleon and George III glare at one another. Indeed, just 14 months later, the war is resumed. But not all was war or politics. Here, amid a campaign to rid Britain of smallpox, Gilray shows us Edward Jenner administering his new cowpox vaccine to a highly suspicious population. And lo and behold, I told you so, cows are now sprouting out from all parts of their bodies. As George III descended into madness, it fell to Gilray's contemporary, Thomas Rowlandson, to depict the king's estranged, wayward sons bursting into their father's sick room, a bottle of celebratory champagne at the ready, asking, "Is he dead yet?" Social and political satire were not confined to Britain. In Spain, the ever-sharp eye of Gilray's contemporary, the brilliant, if dour, Francisco Goya, was constrained by that country's guardian of public morality, the Inquisition. As a consequence, in his series of prints, Los Caprichos, or Caprices, a critique of contemporary Spanish society, he was obliged to give his often acerbic images bland titles to avoid unwelcome attention. Here, the public shaming of a citizen who, head bowed, listens to the inquisitor's charges against him. Goya's caption blandly reads, "A speck of dust." Goya felt on safer grounds, pricking pomposity. Here he reveals his low opinion of the medical profession with an acider physician taking the pulse of a patient who is clearly already dead. The caption reads, I wonder what's the matter with him. In France, Honoré Daumier had no compunction satirizing all and sundry. Sometimes kindly, as in this depiction of the brainy writer and politician Victor Hugo. But more often less kindly, as in this depiction of the French King Louis Philippe, whose distinctive facial features here morph into a pear. A series of images that would inspire William Kentridge to create his groundbreaking stop-action movies, which I'm sure many of you already know. Now, throwing caution to the wind, Daumier depicts King Louis Philippe as gargantuan, sitting on a commode, consuming an endless stream of praise from sycophants, while defecating honours and titles. This proved too much for the authorities, earning Daumier a 6-month prison sentence and a fine. Chastened, Daumier now played things safe, with a set of prints skewering the legal profession. Here, at the end of a divorce case, which left both parties financially ruined, one gleeful lawyer says to the other, "Ha-ha, but we've got our fees." By the second half of the 19th century, following the lead of the British humorous weekly Punch, political cartoons were now appearing in publications in both Europe and North America, attracting a following for their ability to capture world events in a single, easily understood image. One of the most enduring is this image by Punch's resident cartoonist John Tenniel, to which he gave the title "Dropping the Pilot." It shows Otto von Bismarck, who had unified and ably led Germany as its first chancellor, now with dignity descending the ship's ladder, having been summarily dismissed by an erratic Kaiser Wilhelm II, here looking down from the ship's rail. Equally memorable, by another Punch cartoonist, is this image of Cecil Rhodes, taking the measure of an Africa he is bestriding like a colossus in the name of Queen Victoria. By the 20th century, the mantle had passed to David Lowe, with this image published in London's Evening Standard newspaper, in the wake of the cynical non-aggression pact signed between Germany and the Soviet Union just 10 days before the outbreak of the Second World War. Courtesy incarnate, as Hitler bows low, greeting Stalin with the words, "Scum of the earth, I presume," to which Stalin replies, "Bloody assassination, bloody assassin of the workers." The rest is history. And so to our own time, with perhaps the most savage of political cartoonists, Gerald Scarfe, here in this self-portrait, about to meticulously dissect his victim with his pen and brush. Perhaps most famously here, with the last words of his favourite victim, Margaret Thatcher, "You're all bloody useless." Closely followed, I think, by this portrait of Donald Trump being sworn in as the 45th President of the United States, promising to make America hate again. To which Tiny Tim, at the end of Dickens's Christmas Carol, will now respond, God help us, everyone. Thank you.
Excellent.
You enjoyed that.
I have to say the art is really,
There's a lot to that.
yeah,
It's pretty good.
100%. It's really good.
Once you know the back, you know a bit about the artist. And the time to see it working in, it all makes.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, but if you just look at it as a picture and say, well, that's a bit of it's fine. But